Good evening, please be seated. Thank you all for joining us this evening at the Dean's Lecture Series. A question period, as many of you know, will follow the lecture after a break of about 10 minutes. It'll be down the hall to the left of this room. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Maher, who will be delivering his lecture entitled Self-Love and Love of Another Self. Professor Maher is chair of the philosophy department at Assumption College. He's written, studied, and lectured extensively on political philosophy and theology, with special emphasis on ethics. He served as a consultant on ethics to the National Catholic Bioethics Center, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops Ad Hoc Committee on Healthcare, and to the Roman Catholic Bishops of Maryland. Professor Maher's approach to ethics is refreshingly and productively straightforward. He investigates the question of what it is to be an excellent human being, and he does so with the help of some of the greatest minds in history, such as those we encounter in our seminar readings. The lion's share of his work has been on Aristotle, but his studies span from classical Greek to modern philosophy. He spent a significant amount of time studying Bacon and Descartes. Most recently, he has been considering the role of philosophy in liberal education. I know Dan from my days in graduate school at Boston College, where I was fortunate enough to develop an enduring friendship with him. He's amongst the people with whom I've had the deepest, most earnest conversations, the kind one does not forget and that make one more grateful for being alive. His impact is traceable partly to the fact that his life revolves around his own learning, which he pursues with a view to living an excellent life. His teaching emerges from these attitudes towards learning and living and is properly and fruitfully secondary to them. In that regard, he embodies what are arguably the highest and most essential attributes of a tutor. Dan has an inspiring seriousness. I would like to think it goes without saying that he is therefore not a dusty academic. I know him as a beautiful writer with a refined aesthetic sensibility, and I have it on good authority from Mr. Grenke that Dan is a monster on the basketball court. I wish he were a permanent part of our community. In lieu of that, please join me in welcoming him to our community this evening.
Thank you. That was a very generous introduction. I hope all those days aren't in my past, although sometimes I worry. In this lecture tonight, I thank you. I'm very pleased to be back here on the campus of St. John's College in Santa Fe. In this lecture, I want to explore a series of distinctions. For the most part, these distinctions come in pairs, and each distinction comes to light in the form of seeing or registering that this is not that. Two that are similar and might be confused are in fact different, and that difference must also be appreciated. The recognition of otherness is the opposite of what in poetics Aristotle says happens when we identify an image with what it is an image of. If you watch someone begin drawing a cartoon quality representation of a rabbit or a caricature of someone you know, you enjoy it when the image as such appears, when what was at first merely lines gives way to or coalesces into a likeness. If I could put on a show and draw for you a passing image of Bugs Bunny, a fair number of you would smile as you came to realize what my drawing amounts to. In important ways, an image is nothing like what it images. A sketch of a rabbit is not at all like a rabbit. And yet, as Aristotle puts it, we delight in seeing this is that. We enjoy images because they display the intelligibility of what they image, and we delight in the learning they make possible. The opposite recognition, this is not that, is also illuminating, but I'm not sure it so readily and so universally gives pleasure. Seeing that virtue is different from mere self-restraint, or that memory is different from imagination, is the registration of a distinction, the separation of one kind from another kind, one form from another. Aristotle famously says that being is said in many ways, And understanding that multitude requires determining in just how many ways being is said. Appreciating formal differences is necessary, then, to clear and precise thinking. And in our practice, it keeps us from mistreating one thing as if it were another. We should not treat the vicious person as if he were simply morally weak. We should not respond to an expression of friendship as if it were an invitation to romance, or to mere politeness as if it were an offer of friendship. Because one thing can look like another without being that other, that is, because images and appearances can deceive, we need clarifying distinctions that separate one from another. Distinctions eliminate confusion in thought and speech and action. Here, at the beginning of my talk on self-love, I risk self-parody by being self-consciously self-referential, but here goes. Drawing an image differs from drawing a distinction. More formally put, the understanding appropriate to identification is not the same as the understanding appropriate to differentiation. In what follows, I draw attention to some differences. I have 7 distinctions in all, and I'll array them in order, and I hope it makes some sense as we go along. Let me begin with Aristotle's formula that a friend is another self. He asserts an identification, or at least a likeness, between one friend and another. He emphasizes this likeness in several passages, such as this claim. When I'm quoting, I'll raise my hand so you know, and that will make it a little easier to keep track of when I'm speaking and when I'm not. As someone is disposed toward himself, so is he also toward a friend. And this one, the extreme degree of friendship is like the one in relation to himself. In the best friendship, one wishes goods to another in a manner that is akin to the way one wishes goods to oneself. Obviously, in these passages, Aristotle is speaking of complete friendship, also called friendship based on virtue. Such friends are useful and pleasant to one another, which is to say, they are goods to and for one another. And for this reason, it would be wrong to call this kind of friendship self-forgetting or selfless. It is marked rather by an expansion of wishing goods to oneself for one's own benefit. In the best form of friendship, Aristotle says, the friend is good in himself and good for his friend. Wishing goods to the friend is not opposed to wishing goods for oneself. This friendship intensifies concern with one's own good by drawing another into it, but not as if the friend were simply for me. Friends are a single soul, he says, citing a proverb, which reinforces the notion of the friend as a second self, wishing goods to oneself in the same way one seeks one's own good. The reciprocal and active goodwill between friends does not reduce to exchanging goods, but consists rather in sharing them. As another proverb Aristotle cites has it, the things of friends are common. And yet we must not overlook an important difference or division within the friendship. Each loves the other on condition of having recognized the other's goodness, but each loves himself, we might say, unconditionally. Whereas friendship depends upon recognition that the other person is good, pleasant, or useful, all people love themselves and wish themselves good things irrespective of any appraisal of whether they themselves are good, pleasant, or useful. So when Aristotle says, as someone is disposed toward himself, so is he also toward a friend, we must say, not so fast. This is not that. Self-love is not the same as love of another self. Self-love is universal in the sense that each person wishes good things to himself, but friendship is selective and wishes goods only to someone who has passed the test. In fact, only the best human beings meet the standard for this sort of friendship. Aristotle writes, one should expect such friendships to be rare, since few people are like that. Furthermore, it requires also time and familiarity. They cannot accept each other as friends then or be friends until each is plainly seen by the other to be lovable and gains the other's trust. Those who quickly do for each other things characteristic of friendship, though they wish to be friends, in fact are not, unless they are furthermore lovable, and they know this. Not all human beings are lovable. The Nicomachean Ethics as a whole, the books in friendship on particular, catalog the reasons why most people are not lovable as required for the best form of friendship, which indicates that the best human being, a good human being, would not wish them well for their own sakes, at least not with the attitude he takes toward his friend. and yet all those unlovable people wish themselves well. So I should amend my prior statement and say, rather, not all human beings are lovable by someone else. They are in fact lovable and loved by themselves in the sense they all wish themselves well. Self-love is amoral insofar as it occurs in each human being without reference to the character or virtue of the person. And even in the virtuous person, self-love is not conditioned on the recognition of one's own virtue. The good human being recognizes his virtue and recognizes it as excellence not found everywhere, and yet it is not the case that he loves himself because he has that earned excellence in him. Virtue is in him because he has loved himself. To put Aristotle's point somewhat pointedly, I would say that while we require a reason to love someone else, we love ourselves for no particular reason. The remarks I have to make tonight are elements of the path I've followed as I've tried to make sense of this phenomenon. Is self-love unquestionable, or can we discover some intelligibility in it? Here I distinguish three types of questions: two pseudo-questions and a class of genuine questions. In the metaphysics, Aristotle indicates simple identities are unquestionable. You cannot meaningfully ask, why is a triangle a three-sided plane figure? One can only give the same answer for every such question, because it is what it is. This can at most be turned into contemplation of the necessary identity of each being. But then the question is not really about a triangle, but about being as being. Genuine questions ask why something belongs to something else. There needs to be otherness between the one and the other in the question. For example, I can ask why Helen is smiling when she walks into the room. She need not be smiling, but she is. Smiling is something she always can do, so we need to look for something beyond the power to account for why she is smiling now. In a third type of question, there is too much separation between the items. And this question, too, fails to be meaningful. Why does it always rain when I plan a picnic? Here, we only have a coincidence. Right? There are not two things that are genuinely attached to one another. There is merely apparent unity between the planning and the rain. No cause stands to be discovered as the source of this phony phenomenon. Between the case of simple identity, like the triangle in its essence, and the pure coincidence, there are cases like Helen and her smile, but also the case of the property of risibility that belongs to her. It is not simply identical with her essence, yet as a property it is necessary. There's enough otherness there that we can investigate how and why this property belongs to the human essence and not to other animals. We can see, at least, that it does not follow simply from our nature as animals. Animal might not be risible, but in the human case it is. And so we can meaningfully ask why. And so, returning to the question at hand, I ask, how is self-love attached to us? It is far too ubiquitous to be simply accidental. Is it then simply necessary and unquestionable? Are we nothing but agents of self-regard in the way the triangle is its three sides? Is self-love bedrock in us, or is there some intelligibility to be discovered as to why we seek our own good? The distinction between self-love and love of another self seems to indicate that self-love does not follow from a moral appraisal of ourselves. If self-love were morally conditional, there would be less of it. In the best form of friendship, the friend's love is always conditional, and it is a rather steep condition. It has to overcome what we think of other people before we know them well. Aristotle says, only the friendship of good people is impervious to slander. Slander is false and malicious or defamatory speech. Would you believe that a member of the faculty at my college was arrested for soliciting prostitutes? Twice. Each time I try this question out with students at my own college, all are willing to believe it. If Aristotle's telling the truth, all or most of you are willing to believe it too. Despite the fact that slander is false, almost everyone is vulnerable to it because almost everyone else is willing to believe very bad things about nearly everyone. My unscientific survey suggests Aristotle is probably right, but it bears mentioning that his point with this is not so much that people are credulous when the gossip is nasty, but rather that most people are in fact bad. Because our experience teaches us that most people do bad things, we find reports, even false reports, offered without evidence, credible. It takes a long time to find out that someone is, unlike most people, genuinely good and therefore lovable on account of his or her own character. Only the friendship of the good, which is very rare, is impervious to slander. My first distinction was between self-love and love of another self. The one is automatic or amoral, the other conditional. My second distinction is between kinds of questions. The question I have raised, why do we love ourselves, might be a pseudo-question or it might be a genuine question. I think we can gain some insight into this by considering another distinction Aristotle makes between two forms of self-love. One kind of self-love assigns oneself more than one's fair share of honors and money and bodily pleasures, and in general, the sorts of goods that people seek competitively, like pizza, where every slice you eat is one I cannot eat. Pleonexia is the name for the desire for more than one's fair share of these good things. Pleonexia targets goods that cannot really be shared but only divided, and hence the person seeking more than a fair share is blamed. In the second form of self-love, the person assigns to himself the noblest and best goods, obeying and gratifying the leading principle in himself, namely intelligence. In this case, no matter how much knowledge or courage I acquire, there is no depletion of the supply available to you. And so these self-lovers receive no blame, even though, Aristotle says, they are more fully lovers of self than are the first and more numerous sort. For convenience, I refer to these two as the blameworthy self-love and the good self-love. I expect this third distinction is somewhat familiar, and yet we are considering it in what may be an unfamiliar way. The two self-lovers differ in what sorts of goods they wish themselves, but they are the same in that they wish those goods to be their own. I set aside the moral difference between the two and ask about their self-regarding sameness. Why does each wish for himself what he sees as good? The very fact that there are two forms of self-love, at least two forms, suggests that self-love is not simply identical with what we are. Self-love can be in us in more than one way. And so there is some intelligibility to be discovered in how it is in us. We might also appeal to the phenomena of self-destructive behavior, including suicide, as a way of establishing that self-love is not unquestionably present in us. I'm not sure that cuts as deep as is necessary. Admittedly, it is difficult to speak about these matters with certainty, but at least some forms of suicidal thinking reveal themselves as a pursuit of something good, insofar as death promises an improvement on life or in these circumstances. Life itself is not rejected, but this life. Now, that is obviously too superficial to address the complexity of suicide. It seems to me the deepest alternative to self-love, understood as the wishing of goods to oneself, would be wishing not to be. Not wishing death as an escape from suffering, but wishing not to be at all, no matter what goods or evils might be available here or in some other life. Imagine a Christian who believes in the immortality, that is to say, the indestructibility of the human person or the human soul, and yet dreads that. This person neither wants heaven nor fears hell, but instead desires no part of anything and simply wishes not to be at all. Is that meaningful? Or is this too somehow a seeking of the good as this person understands it? Is seeking what we see as good inescapable for us? It's hard to examine these things from this depth or at this level of abstraction. Let us return to more ordinary considerations. I've already characterized self-love as amoral in the sense that it does not depend upon a moral appraisal of oneself, nor is it based upon a recognition of the kind of being one is, as if there were some intuition that I am human or I have dignity, and therefore I love myself as that sort of being. Other people recognize my humanity, but they do not automatically love me for it. Love is not a necessary reaction to the presence of a human being. Aristotle comes at the automatic or reflexive self-regard all or most people exhibit from the point of view of friendship. He lists 4 or 5 friendly characteristics, philika in Greek. Friends wish for and do what is or appears good for one another's sakes. They wish that their friends exist and live. They spend time together. They choose the same things. They share their sorrows and joys. These characteristics seem, Aristotle says, to have come from the ways one acts towards oneself. It's unclear whether he means friendship has a causal origin in self-love, or he means rather there's a kind of analogy between the attitude toward oneself and that toward one's friend. However that may be, he says each of these friendly characteristics does hold for a good person in relation to himself. At this moment, I draw your attention to two prominent items on the list. A bit further on, we'll see an important tension between them, but first I want to try to refine what self-love is. The first of the Philika is the wish that the friend attains goods. The second, the wish that the friend be or exist or live. Goods and life are wished toward the friend because the friend is understood to be good, as we have said previously, but they are wished to oneself automatically. We wish to be for our own sake, quite apart from whether we are good. To be is especially good for the good person, Aristotle says. Existing is for everyone worth choosing and lovable, and perceiving that one lives is one sort of thing that is pleasant in its own right, since life is by nature a good thing. To be is good for anyone, but especially good for the good person. The best way to think about this might be to say that existence or being is the first or most basic good we wish ourselves. This is the question I am after here. Why exactly do we wish the good in our own direction? In other words, we do not love the good in the sense that we want it to exist somewhere, nor do we wish goods generously to any and all human beings indiscriminately. Rather, we wish goods to our own selves, whatever our condition might be. The distinction I would like to highlight at this point is that between self-regarding love and self-forgetting love. Aristotle distinguished a blameworthy form of self-love and a good form. The latter form is still a self-regarding love. It is not disinterested or self-forgetful. It is true, Aristotle explains in the context where he distinguishes them. The good form might lead one to sacrifice oneself for others, but that action is still presented as self-regarding. The one who dies for the benefit of others does so in pursuit of nobility for himself. He chooses his action as somehow good for him to do. A self-forgetting love would be one that really just wants the good to be without any concern that it be one's own. This might sound fanciful, that a human being would wish for the good as such, could wish that the good be and exist apparently because that would be good for the good. This kind of claim makes sense to people who think that the amoral love of oneself I have been describing is actually a form of injustice. Self-love or egoism has been compared to unjust preferences like racism. An arbitrary division between myself and all other human beings is accompanied by an irrational preference for myself. Now, this is not Aristotle's virtuous human being who does just deeds for their own sake. Aristotle's noble form of self-love is not that impartial, universalistic devotion to goodness itself. The distinction I want to highlight is between Aristotle's noble love of self and the ideal moral agent of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, whom Mill characterizes as acting in the manner of a disinterested and benevolent spectator. The good action has nothing in particular to do with a particular person's happiness, with his or her desire to live a good life. For Mill, when deciding on the moral goodness of an action, we must take into account the interests of mankind collectively, or at least of mankind indiscriminately. In his words, the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. Altruism, or living for others, in Kant's phrase, is not quite natural. It needs to overcome the naturally selfish feelings that incline us to put ourselves and our happiness first. Mill knows, of course, that people are not impartial by nature. By nature, all human beings are constituted so as to be incapable of desiring anything except what they understand as their own happiness, or what is a means to their own happiness. But any conception of happiness that makes my happiness more important than that of others is unjust. I ought to be impartially interested in all and disinterested in each, including myself. Each selfish agent ought to overcome the preoccupation with his own good. By what might be called the ruse of utilitarianism, the person is to be socialized into making the general happiness a principal ingredient in the individual's conception of happiness. This other-regarding, disinterested, and benevolent spectator is not Aristotle's self-regarding lover of the noble. Aristotle's way of bringing to light the self-regard of his good form of self-love is worth considering. Those who are self-lovers in the fullest sense wish better goods to themselves than do those who are caught up with desire for the kinds of goods people fight over. But there is a limit to the goods they wish themselves. We can, he says, only wish ourselves those goods that are compatible with our remaining in being as the sort we are. For this reason, we cannot wish divine perfection to ourselves. If divine goodness came to me, it would not be me who is then divine. Divine perfection cannot be in me, but only in my stead. To wish that divine perfection be amounts to wishing that I cease being and be replaced by God. And this places a limit both on what I wish myself and what I wish my friend. He presents this even more clearly when he asks whether one person wishes his friend the greatest goods, namely that his friend become God. Our well-wishing to another is constrained by the limits of human nature. In his words, the friend would need to remain the sort of being he is. It is as a human being, then, that he will wish the greatest goods. When we wish goods to a human being for that person's own sake, we wish those goods compatible with his remaining in being as the sort of being he is. And this means there is no getting around the more or less unstable way that human beings have goods. We wish ourselves and one another well precisely because even the goods we have can be lost. No one wishes God well because, after all, God cannot lose his perfection. Human fragility requires temporal endurance of the loving. This is not the sort of activity that aims at its own termination. Activities like building or healing aim at a completion or telos in which or at which the activity ceases. But friends do not aim at being done with wishing good things to one another. Human loving, whether directed at oneself or another, aims at continuing in being. We who love ourselves aim at remaining in being as the imperfect beings we are. This helps to clarify the nature of self-love up to a point, but it leaves matters somewhat mysterious, even if it makes sense to constrain one's wish for good things by reference to a more fundamental wish to remain in being. In another sense, this seems to intensify the question. Why should my limitations limit the good? It is as if I were to say, I only love the goods I can enjoy. The goods that cannot be mine are nothing to me. I love nothing that is finally higher than myself in the sense that it is beyond my reach. On this view, even the so-called good form of self-love starts to collapse back into the selfishness of the other form of self-love. And the alternative to this seems to be to love something as if it were good, although it is not a good for me. What could such disinterested love be? Let me try another distinction as a way to open up this question. The distinction here is between two notions of self. Aristotle does not explain what he means by self in his characterization of the friend as another self, which is a formula he uses repeatedly. Apart from his use of this term for describing a friend, which he adapted from a proverb, the Greek term autos seems not to have been used as a substantive noun in classical Greek. Autos functions ordinarily as an adjective meaning same, or an intensive pronoun as Plato uses it in phrases like the just itself. If the term is unusual in Greek, it is quite common in contemporary English. We have a magazine called Self. So we have one familiar possibility for what Aristotle might have meant by the self that we love. As far as I'm aware, the first appearance of what has come to be known in contemporary English as the self occurs in Descartes' second meditation, as he is forging the modern concept of soul. At this point in his argument, Descartes has accepted it as established that he is and is a thinking thing, and he is regarding as illusion everything else, including his body and the whole material world. He has begun to question what else he is. And yet, may it not perhaps be the case, he says, that these very things which I am supposing to be nothing, body, vapor, wind, fire, air, or breath penetrating the body, because they are unknown to me, are in reality identical with the I of which I am aware. I do not know, and for the moment I shall not argue the point. The I is epistemologically determined and ontologically indeterminate. The self, or consciousness, is aware of itself without conceiving itself as essentially material or immaterial, or as related or unrelated to any other being. Unlike the soul as traditionally conceived, the self is not a part of the a natural whole that is itself a part within the cosmic whole. The self is simply conscious of itself as conscious. Descartes confirms the metaphysical neutrality of this self-conception in the fourth meditation. But now, he says, besides the knowledge that I exist insofar as I am a thinking thing, an idea of corporeal nature comes into my mind, and I happen to be in doubt as to whether the thinking nature which is in me, or rather which I am, is distinct from this corporeal nature or identical with it. Descartes does not call what he knows himself to be the self. He calls it rather the me or the I. But what he describes seems to be, once we subtract Descartes' precision, pretty nearly what contemporary speakers of English would recognize as the self. The self is conceived as it experiences itself, not as it is in itself. Locke recognized this and expressed it with perfect clarity. Self is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded, it matters not. The empirically determined but metaphysically indeterminate self is compatible not only with materialism but with any metaphysical or anti-metaphysical attitude. Whether the self so conceived must be made to disappear under the influence of contemporary neuroscience, I cannot say, but for the time being at least, we can speak about this self in an experiential way without committing ourselves to any doctrine as to its ultimate nature, and we can do so while accepting modern science as an authoritative science of body. Needless to say, Aristotle never had the experience of modern science's victories to persuade himself to think of himself in so restricted a fashion. Despite the use of the modern-sounding substantive self, and despite certain formulations that suggest Aristotle thinks of the human person as essentially, or perhaps primarily, as mind or nous, there are other reasons to think he means something rather more ordinary by the term self. He restricts the phrase other self to cases in which there is a strong concern for the well-being of the whole person. If self were just a name for the heart or the core of a human being, any two friends of any type would qualify as a pair of selves. But in the forms of friendship other than the complete sense, he says, it is not insofar as he is just what he is that he is loved. Ordinary friends are not related as other selves. In the Comachene Ethics, there are 4 uses of this phrase. 2 occur in the examination of whether the happy human being needs friends. In an earlier passage, the formula appears when he discusses the philia, those relations characteristic of a human being in relation to himself and to his friend. In the first instance, Aristotle uses this phrase to capture the relationship between parents and children. As he puts it, so then, parents love their children as themselves, since the children that come from them are like other selves, from being separated off. Our children belong to us because they are generated from our bodies, falling out of us like hair or teeth. But it is not this, he says that, I'm just repeating it. But it is not this that makes them like other selves. A child is like another self because a parent's self-love embraces the child too. Not as if that love has been extended to another person, but as if the parent has been physically divided. For parents are fond of their children as something of themselves. Parental love arises not as moral friendship, but as what may be called natural or physical friendship. Parents' love for the child shares in the naturalness and immediacy of self-love. The parent's self-love is prior in time to love for the child. Love for the child is prior to the appearance of good or bad character in the child. There is no more reason or justification, and I suppose there is no less reason or justification for loving one's children than there is for loving oneself. Parental love's blindness has an analog in the blindness, or better, indifference of self-love to one's own distinguishing moral features. Loving the child as another self means the parents wish the child well for the child's own sake. They must take the child as a being for whom there is a good and bad, in the sense of happiness and misery, and they engage themselves practically in the child's well-being. Even before the child can act, parents seek his good for him and prepare him to seek happiness himself. But parents are only like other selves, which distinguishes them from the adult child's own friends. And so self might mean the whole human being, which is what parents love and what they trouble themselves over. It seems worth noting a connection between this distinction and one considered above. In the passage where Aristotle concluded that one person would not wish his friend to become God, he says very emphatically, it is to him as a human being, anthropos, that he will wish the greatest of goods. The inclusion of this term, where Aristotle might have spoken more indefinitely, indicates the friend is a human being and not a shadowy self in Locke's sense. Nonetheless, we must also see there are passages in which Aristotle speaks of mind or nous as what each of us primarily is, and this seems to suggest he has in mind something rather more like the modern notion of self as a principle of thinking somehow separable from or independent of the rest of what we are. So when we speak of self-love, it makes sense to keep in mind this distinction as identifying at least two possible ways of figuring out what the object of that love is. It seems to me that with this distinction, we are led into the whole question of whether human happiness can consist in some single good activity or it involves a mixed life. The discussion of the self has already led me into my next distinction, which is between two ways we can be ordered toward the good. We can be ordered toward the good by a consciously chosen purpose, or we can be ordered to it by a natural and unchosen end. The distinction between end and purpose is fundamental and clarifying, but at the same time rather elusive, not least because ends and purposes can also overlap. Let me begin with a simple version of the distinction and move towards the case it is important for us to consider. The end of medicine is health, but a doctor who practices medicine might have as his purpose satisfying a desire to win honor, to gain money, or to relieve suffering. A purpose is anything someone might seek and desire. An end is the completion of a being or a process. An end is not necessarily the target of conscious desire, although it may be. Artifacts have minds, have ends mindfully built into what they are. The end of a shoe may be walking or dancing or running, depending on what the shoe is built to be. The shoe might be used for other purposes, such as killing a spider or holding open a door. But the walking or dancing or running belongs to the shoe in a different way than do those other uses. The shoe has an end, but it has no purposes. A dancing shoe does not wish to appear on Dancing with the Stars, nor does it hope for a long and easy life in the back of the closet of some girl who decides she does not really want to dance. In nature, the end of a bunny is to become a rabbit and live a rabbit's life. The egg is intrinsically ordered to becoming a chicken. Neither the egg nor the chicken is by nature ordered to becoming a meal, although that is one of the purposes to which they can be put. If we leave aside for the present whether animals are capable of executing purposes, it seems that purposes originate in the human will, but ends themselves are there prior to the activity of will. Human practices, such as farming and doctoring, also have ends that are prior to and independent of the purposes adopted by those who engage in these activities. Aristotle begins Nicomachean Ethics with an appeal to the ends that structure our activities. Generalship is for victory, rhetoric for persuasion, household management for wealth. These goods determine the quality of choices made by people who aim to practice the activities. The purposes adopted by the practitioner might be consistent with or destructive of the natural end of the activity. The person who aims to make a living by practicing medicine might do so without corrupting the art's orientation towards health, or the person might subordinate that end to the purpose of money-making and proceed to take advantage of patients and their lack of understanding in order to enrich himself at their expense. In the case of artifacts, a pen might be used as a bookmark temporarily without damage to its integrity as a functioning pen, but it might also be used to pry something open, and this could destroy its nature. Insofar as human beings become doctors or generals or whatever sort, they have a proper function toward an end. But what about the human being as such? Do we have an end or only purposes? The bodily parts seem to have ends. Eyes are for seeing and so on. But what about the body as a whole? Aristotle speaks of eudaimonia, happiness, as the final end, structuring all other activities and choices. But is happiness an end or is it a purpose? There is clearly a misuse of a human being, analogous to the destructive misuse of artifacts. In politics, Aristotle speaks of the natural slave, but he also speaks of the injustice of conventional slavery and of hunting human beings as food or for sacrifice. The misuse implies a proper use or function, which implies an end. If we have an end, we are not equally open to all the things that might happen to us or be done with us, even by ourselves. The end would establish the framework within which human beings perceive things as desirable, but that framework itself would not be the product of human desire. If eudaimonia is human perfection or completion or fulfillment, it is not best understood as the satisfaction of human desire. For although happiness does satisfy, a human being might well desire things that are not part of or not compatible with human fulfillment. An end is antecedent to desire and sets the context for desire. John Locke, by contrast, conceives of happiness as a purpose. Locke's self is inert and ordered toward nothing until pain disturbs it, and then it seeks something different from what it already has. No end by nature structures the discrimination among possible sources of relief. Those objects of desire either satisfy, in the sense that no additional pain disturbs and goads us to further activity, or those objects do not satisfy, and then we seek something else to stop the pain. Locke mocks the notion of a human end and substitutes for it whatever the individual human being is willing to settle for. We might distinguish end from purpose in the human case also by contrasting Aristotle's thesis at the beginning of metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know, with Descartes' declared project at the beginning of Meditations. Descartes does not announce a natural end, but his self-chosen goal of establishing something firm and lasting in the sciences. To have an end is to be constituted not as neutral or indeterminate center of awareness and action, but teleologically as a being for whom there is a good prior to desires and wishes and hopes. What constitutes an end as good is not the fact that we want it, but rather the fact that it perfects us as what we are. This leads me to a final distinction between the good and the apparent good. This theme, which is an inescapable practical problem, runs through the entire Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle introduces it in the competing conceptions of what happiness is. It occupies a crucial position in the account of moral virtue and practical wisdom, and he makes it central to the treatment of friendship as well. We've already touched upon its role in the two forms of self-love he distinguishes, but it also bears mentioning that in all cases, the good that does not appear good cannot move a human being to action. The good appears differently to different people. What seems good to each of us in particular depends in part upon our character, which is formed somewhat accidentally from our upbringing and our prior actions. Aristotle has no trouble declaring that the virtuous person, the one with practical wisdom, is the standard for judgment. The good man judges each class of things rightly, and in each the truth appears to him. For each state of character has its own ideas of the noble and the pleasant, and perhaps the good man differs from others most by seeing the truth in each class of things, being, as it were, the norm and measure of them. This person is like a law unto himself. But the problem of appearances remains, at least partly because the superiority of the virtuous person appears properly only to the virtuous person himself. The coward, secure in his cowardice, looks at the courageous person and sees someone reckless. The rash person, secure in his rashness, looks at the courageous person and sees a coward. And so on for liberality and gentleness and moderation and all the virtues. Only the virtuous person sees virtue and both vices for what they are, but he can no more persuade the coward of his blindness than the coward can persuade him of the excellence of a life free of danger. At least early in the ethics, the vicious and virtuous human being display a parallel structure, a coherence of character, desire, thinking, and action. Vice may be a kind of ignorance of the end of human beings, but the vicious human being does not see it that way. The virtuous and the vicious each live in harmony with what they understand the human good to be. Each wishes to himself for his own sake the things that appear good. Aristotle would add that the good man judges rightly, and this may even be true, but there is something immensely dissatisfying about this result. For the virtuous human being, too, loves himself amorally and prior to his acquisition of virtue. His instantiation of a chosen life shares the same formal structure as that of each other human being, namely, a kind of amoral seeking of the good for oneself. In this context, I think it is helpful to consider a bit of text from Plato's Laws. It's a bit long, I apologize. There's some good ideas in it. The stranger says, "The truth is that the excessive friendship for oneself is the cause of all of each man's wrongdoing on every occasion. Everyone who cares for something is blind when it comes to the thing cared for, and hence is a poor judge of what is just and good and noble. because he believes he should always honor his own more than the truth. Yet a man who is to attain greatness must be devoted not to himself or to what belongs to him, but to what is just, whether it happens to be done by himself or by someone else. This same failing is the source of everyone supposing that his lack of learning is wisdom. As a result, we think we know everything when in fact we know, so to speak, nothing. And when we refuse to turn over to others what we don't know how to do, we necessarily go wrong by trying to do them ourselves. So every human being should flee excessive self-love and should instead always pursue someone who is better than himself without putting any feeling of shame in the way. Excessive self-love seems to mean not an extreme degree of self-love, but rather love directed to oneself as good when one is not good. One is ignorant, but one feels wise, and regards one's ignorance as if it were wisdom. The thesis that all people are bad judges in their own cases, a view Aristotle also expresses, calls into question the isolated virtuous human being as the proper self-lover of the human good. One should not underestimate the difficulty of recognizing what is genuinely good as distinct from its mere appearance. Some time ago, I quoted Aristotle saying, "Those who quickly do for each other things characteristic of friendship, though they wish to be friends, in fact are not, unless they are furthermore lovable, and they know this." It seems that most of us might be in just this position with respect to ourselves. We try to wish good things to ourselves too quickly before we know what the good is. Enter friendship. Here a second human being who is a good judge and whose judgment is not compromised by self-interest appraises the first human being in his orientation toward the good. And this second person judges the first to be good as a human being and lovable, not as advantageous, but as good in himself. The second person judges the first as deserving of the good things the first wishes to himself without regard to what he deserves. Whereas the first self wishes good things to himself out of what may be inescapable self-love, the second, in becoming a friend of the first, wishes good things to the first as deserved on account of the virtue he sees in the first. The first person in isolation cannot quite achieve this judgment about the goodness of a human life, without the judgments being impugned as self-serving or as indistinguishable from a biased and unduly partial judgment. In some cases, the friend's judgment might instill confidence in the first one, whose judgment or self-conception has begun to waver. In this manner, the one friend would be useful to the other, but not, I suspect, in the sense that the first person could not confidently judge good and bad in the absence of a confirming friend. I think the more important confirmation might possibly operate in the other direction. The second person sees in the first an image of himself. As I said at the beginning, an image is both other and the same, which in Greek would be allos and autos, which are combined to say other self. In seeing an image of himself, the one sees more plainly the nature of his own pursuit of the good. He sees more clearly how strange and questionable it is that all human beings seek the good for themselves even before they have an idea of what the good is or whether they are lovable. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.